It's baffled scholars for 2 millennia. It is a puzzle made of multi-dimensional elements, an enigma with roots that reach back to the dawning of time, perhaps before. Daniel explained part of it. Ezekiel and Isaiah had glimpses into it. John saw it all for the time of the end. That time is now. Join Derek and Sharon Gilbert on a journey that spans the course of history, from Eden to Mount Hermon, from Hermon to Babel, from Babel to Rome, from Rome to the cross, and from there to us. Biblical prophecy is coming true before your eyes, and to understand it, you must discern the times both then and now. It's time to unravel the threads of this all-encompassing prophetic paradox. It's time to unravel Revelation.
Welcome to Unraveling Revelation. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I get to be Mrs. Derek Gilbert, Sharon Gilbert here, and we're delighted that you have joined us once again in our Studio G1, right in our home, one of our bedrooms.
Bring us into your home and into your smartphone or tablet with our free app, which gets you all of our video content, plus an audio Bible and a calendar of our upcoming events, things like that. But most of all, it bypasses the gatekeepers of big tech. Most smart TVs, like the one in the back of the room here, are compatible with Google's Chromecast or Apple's AirPlay, which means if you download it to the mobile app, you don't need to watch it on the small screen. You can cast it to your big screen with no wires involved. This is sort of the wave of the future, and they're trying to make it easy. So do that, and you'll get access to all of our content, plus my weekly podcast, our weekly Bible study, which is really what inspires us each week. And you'll find the link at gilberthouse.org/app.
And I want to remind you that this is hosted and created by a Christian company called Subsplash. We love them. A lot of our friends in ministry also use Subsplash. A lot of big churches do. So this is the kind of safe place, a safe haven for all of our content. It's not going to be, shoved out or shadow banned.
Yes, or suddenly disappear from the internet, which has happened as well. So yeah, do take advantage of that. Again, it's absolutely free, and we love the features they've included, like the audio Bible in there with multiple translations. So you can choose the translation you prefer and have it read to you for those times when you need to listen instead of watching the screen and reading on the screen. So it's a wonderful thing.
I so love digging in and getting to the original language, and we've tried over the last, 3 years? How long have we been doing this?
We're in our 3rd year. We're up to program 165 or thereabouts.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, we're really trying to dig into the language of the Bible and prophecy, because when you unravel Revelation being the prophecy and the insight that the Lord has given to his people over the millennia, we have to dig all the way back to Genesis and other extra biblical texts.
Right.
And we're going to talk about one of those today.
Yeah, this is really something that I would like to say I stumbled onto it, but it really was the Lord kind of guiding me and nudging me. Every now and again, I just get this sense that something I'm reading or researching is important, and I don't even know why until I start. And I have to credit the Holy Spirit with that, for which is not to say that I am divinely inspired in any of this work. By no means. Anything we get right is His credit. Anything we get wrong, and I get a lot wrong, that's on us. But there are things that we sometimes learn that during these rabbit trails that we follow, which is why there are so many on this program.
This house is filled with bunny trails, just all over the place.
Anyway, this came out of some reading that I was doing about the Essenes, and that led to a couple of things. Number one, the importance of the geography of Jesus' ministry and why he based his ministry in the north. That led to the work of he's a physician, and he and his wife, their names are John and Gloria Ben Daniel. And if we have not yet reached out to you by the time this airs, trust me, we will soon, because I'd love to meet them because they're in the old city of Jerusalem.
I know.
And we'll be there in March, and details on that coming up.
And maybe you can be there too.
Yes. He has been doing a lot of really fascinating research into the Book of Enoch and the Essenes. Now, the Essenes are credited with being the authors of a number of books, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have helped our understanding of the Bible.
Right. I'm going to stop you for a minute because I'm going to play the character of those who are watching and have never heard of any of this.
Okay.
Many of you have lots of information. You have read the Book of Enoch. You've read commentaries on the Book of Enoch, but some of you have never ever heard of this book. First of all, tell me about the Book of Enoch and then explain who the Essenes were.
All right. The Book of Enoch was a book written in the Second Temple period, and it's broken down
Which is?
The Second Temple period is the period between the destruction of the first, or the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem after Cyrus and then Artaxerxes allowed the Jews to return from Babylon.
So 5th century BC?
5th century BC. The return began around 520 BC. Really, the construction began in earnest around 440 BC with Nehemiah. And the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 AD by the Romans.
Okay.
So that 5-century period there is called the Second Temple period. During the Second Temple period, there were a number of developments in Judaism, changes in the way it was practiced, and the Book of Enoch is the outgrowth, really the product of some of those changes. And we'll get into that history here this week. The Book of Enoch, it was not written by the patriarch Enoch. It is what's called a pseudepigraphal work, meaning it is named for somebody who didn't actually write the book.
Right, but there are a lot of those.
Yes, there are. The Book of Enoch is not in the Bible, but as we've talked before, it is referenced by some of the apostles in the New Testament. 1st and 2nd Peter were clearly influenced by it. The Epistle of Jude also clearly influenced by it. But there are other hints in the New Testament that, for example, the description of the place of eternal punishment in the afterlife being a place of burning, the fire never dies, the worm never sleeps. That really comes out of the Book of Enoch. That's not really in the Old Testament anywhere. Sheol is never described that way in the Old Testament.
And it's also quoted or referred to in the New Testament as well.
Right. Jude explicitly quotes from the book of 1st Enoch. Now, when we say the Book of Enoch, we're really referring to the book of 1st Enoch. There's a 2nd Enoch and a 3rd Enoch that were written well into the Christian era.
Yeah.
So, and those are really weird, and we really don't get into those at all.
First Enoch is pretty reliable.
1st Enoch is reliable, and again, its influence on the New Testament is not well understood by Christians. Dr. Michael Heiser has written a 3 books actually that make reference to this, and these are available.
Is the 3rd one out now?
Well, this would be the 3rd one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm referring to Reversing Hermann.
Oh, yes, that is a foundational book.
Right.
That and the Unseen Realm.
Right. So Reversing Hermann explicitly looks at the influence of the Book of the Watchers, which is the first 36 chapters of what we call the Book of 1st Enoch. What we'll be talking about this week and next week and maybe the week after, depending on how quickly I can get through this, is the second portion of the Book of 1st Enoch, chapters 37 through 71, which scholars call the Book of Parables.
Right.
We've typically, when we refer to the Book of 1st Enoch, we've typically been talking about the Book of the Watchers, the first 36 chapters,
right,
which, like Reversing Hermann by Dr. Heiser, discusses the influence of the rebellious sons of God from Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and the fact that they took human wives, created these monstrous hybrid children called the Nephilim. We've talked about that on this program a number of times. If you're watching this program for any length of time, you're probably familiar with that concept. But we've not really ever discussed anything past chapter 36.
Very few people even know it exists.
Right. The Book of Parables is kind of different, and it's weird. And
it's very similar to John's vision.
Yes, it is. And one of the things that startled me, and I Mike, I'm sorry, have not read your commentary, volume 2 on the Book of Enoch. This is the readers, or a companion to the Book of Enoch, volume 2, which deals with the Book of Parables. I'd kind of set that aside. It's like, I don't need to do the Book of the Watchers is all that matters. But I stumbled onto the work, or was led to the work of Dr. John Ben Daniel.
And because of that, we're now going to read this book because we realized we should have read it long ago.
Exactly. And what John Ben Daniel has been writing and publishing at his, and they've got a website that will refer you to newtorah.org, newtorah.org, but he's also got a site at academia.edu, which we use heavily for the research papers there.
All the time.
And he's published a number of very well-researched papers that have shown me just how important the Book of Parables from First Enoch is. Now, some historic background, if you want to dive into that. Or well, let me do a quick overview here. Why this is important. The Book of the Watchers is important because it shows the influence of these fallen angels, sons of God, on humanity. They corrupted humanity's bloodline by commingling with our DNA, and they taught us things we weren't supposed to know. And then we read that God passed judgment on them. They're chained in gloomy darkness. Enoch is tasked with delivering his message to them. And all of that is described in the first 36 chapters. Beginning at chapter 37, the Book of Parables describes a coming judgment where a messianic figure called the Son of Man, which is a term that we hear read Jesus used of himself multiple times.
We take that phrase for granted.
We do. And most Bible teachers say, well, it's clearly drawn from Daniel chapter 7. The difference is that in Daniel 7, it's a descriptive term, one like a son of man.
Right.
It's not applied as a title in any Jewish writing, which includes the writings of the Hebrew prophets, other than the Book of Parables from First Enoch. So that suddenly is like, whoa, that should be an eye-opener, because Jesus applied that term to himself more than 80 times in the Gospels.
Now, first of all, you guys need to get this book, the companion book to the Book of Enoch.
And get both volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 2.
Yes, you can get those from the Skywatch TV store, skywatchtvstore.com. You mentioned earlier the Essenes.
Right.
Now, how are the Essenes connected to the Book of Enoch?
Now, the Essenes are acknowledged by scholars to be the authors of the Book of Enoch. The first 36 chapters, the Book of the Watchers, has been found at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71, not found at Qumran. Now, this is where the historical background comes into play. I took 10 pages of notes on Dr. Ben Daniel's
Old school.
writings. Yeah.
Look at you.
Yeah. Got to do it with by handwriting, because otherwise I don't retain it. Okay, the Jews returned from Babylon around 520 BC. They really started rebuilding the temple around 440 BC. We talked about that on the programs dealing with the Coming Prince by Sir Robert Anderson.
Yes, another book you really need to have. We should probably publish that.
We should. Okay, we'll talk about that after the show.
Yeah.
Anyway, apparently there was some conflict between those returning from Mesopotamia, from Babylon, and those who had stayed behind and intermarried, because when those came back, those who had returned from Mesopotamia came back and found that they'd commingled with people who were not Jews. Suddenly they were directed to do so, put away your foreign wives and only marry inside the Jewish faith. Well, those efforts to reform only met with limited success. So some of the returnees decided, because they were no longer in charge of what was happening in Judea, to move away. And many of them moved to Damascus and set up a sort of diaspora in Damascus.
These are Essenes.
These would become known as the Essenes eventually. So these separatists, we'll call them at this point, as opposed to the assimilationists, those who, let's marry, let's just get along. And the separatists, they separated. And Damascus became sort of a headquarters for the separatists. Now, around the year 260 BC, the Greek kingdom based in Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom, was in control of Judea. And King Ptolemy II rebuilt the ancient Israelite temple at Dan. That's at the foot of Mount Hermon. Now, 260 BC, at the foot of Dan, might have been a garrison town, because there was a lot of war that had been prophesied by Daniel.
Are we going to tell Dan next March?
Yes, we are.
Oh,
so we'll get a chance to see this and talk about this in Israel. Ptolemy probably set up Dan as a frontier town or a garrison town. That's only 40 miles from Damascus, but it's a more defensible position geographically than Damascus, which was out in the middle of, flat land.
Right.
So to protect against the incursions from the Seleucid kingdom of Syria, which was also one of the successor kingdoms from Alexander the Great.
Exactly.
Ptolemy II set up Dan now this period of time at the base of Mount Hermon in Dan, 260 BC, is about the time scholars agree that the Book of the Watchers, the first 36 chapters of the Book of Enoch, was written, because it mentions the waters of Dan. The angels who had sinned were weeping at a place called Abel Mahin, which is just west of there, a place that we read about in the Old Testament, Avel Beth Maakah. But Enoch was dreaming by the waters of Dan, which we saw during our 2 previous visits, and was...
We didn't see Enoch dreaming.
We didn't see Enoch dreaming, yes. We saw the waters of Dan.
Right.
Anyway, so the geography and the time frame fits with this reestablishment of an Israelite temple at Dan. So these separatists, who eventually would be called the Essenes, were there in the north and were responsible for writing this Book of the Watchers, describing how these sons of God fell, rebelled, corrupted humanity, and were punished.
We need to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to tell you how you can go to Israel, and we're also going to continue this conversation, which I think is totally fascinating, so don't go away.
Spiritual warfare is where the rubber meets the road for us as Christians, but often we treat it as though it doesn't really exist. Well, during the month of November, we're tackling this subject head on as we celebrate the release of Sharon's new novel, The Poisoned Pawn, Book 8 in the Red Wing Saga, a series that teaches spiritual warfare through compelling stories featuring characters that you come to know and love. As part of this special package, we're offering the important new book by our friend Vicki Joy Anderson, They Only Come Out at Night, where she looks at the phenomenon of night terrors or sleep paralysis, examines what the medical community says about it, and then digs into the spiritual forces behind it. And the good news, that there is a way to make it stop. We're also offering our 2-disc DVD set, Unmasking the Ancient Gods, a series of presentations on spiritual warfare, everything from the UFO phenomenon to Jack the Ripper and spiritual warfare in the 19th century, which is really where the storyline of the Red Wing Saga begins. Bought separately, this package is worth $65, but it's yours for just $35 plus shipping and handling during the month of November only. Our spiritual warfare special offer, available only at our online store, gilberthouse.org/store. And as always, we thank you for your prayers and your support. Welcome back to Unraveling Revelation. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I am Sharon Gilbert, and we are so glad that you are joining us once again for this fascinating conversation. Before we go too far, he talked about Tel Dan. We're going to go there next March, and you can join us.
It's... we've got 2 full buses already, still a manageable size. It's good to have a good-sized crew when you go to these places. You can make new friends, have an enjoyable time, but small enough yet that we can get in and out without having to require military-style logistics.
Each bus forms its own little family, and many of those people continue with a family relationship today.
Yeah, and this will be a life-changing experience because we will be talking about things like this, along with our good friend Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, who joins us, will show us the historic locations of the crucifixion site and the tomb of Jesus, the resurrection site.
Oh, I know.
They're not on the regular tours.
Incredible.
Yeah, so join us. You can find out more at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel. From there, you can link to the Lipkin Tours website, look at the itinerary, and reserve your place for our 2023 tour of Israel.
Indeed, and while you are there, check out our store. We have lots of bargains there. In fact, during the month of November, we have a really good bargain that includes Vicki Joy Anderson's book, along with Poison Pawn, and a great DVD about darkness and spiritual warfare. Yeah. But in December, we're going to have several big offers, and one of them is the entire set of Red Wing Saga as it now stands.
The whole collection?
8 books, and you'll save substantially. So check out our store.
Absolutely. Well, the political history of Israel in what we consider the dark period. Most of us Christians are familiar with the period of Israel's history up to about the book of, was it Micah or Malachi is the last one?
You'll have to look.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up.
Look that up.
Anyway, that's between.
I think it's Malachi.
Yeah, that between that and the gospel, it's just sort of a dark period as far as we're concerned.
They're shouting it at the. You guys.
I'll put it on the lower third here. I'll look it up later. But we consider it a dark period. But when there is a lot that happened there during that period of history.
It wasn't as dark as we think.
No. And there's a lot of history that is recorded by Jewish historians like Josephus and Philo of Alexandria, who both mentioned the Essene communities. And a lot of this, again, was prophesied by Daniel, the wars between the Greek successor kingdoms of Alexandria, the one in Syria, the Seleucids, and the one in Egypt, the Ptolemies. They fought over Judea. It was a battle zone. So in the year 198 BC, the Seleucids of Syria replaced the Ptolemies of rulers of Judea, and they began to Hellenize the population. And
they made them Greek.
They made them Greek, right. And this, of course, peaked during the time of Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, who sacrificed a pig to Zeus inside the temple, desecrated the temple. The temple was used for pagan rites for 3 years, from 167 to 164
So it was more than just one day.
BC. Oh, yeah. This was for 3 years. Now, when Antiochus died in 164, his appointed high priest succeeded him for about 5 years, but then he died in 159 BC, and that led to eventually the rebellion of the Maccabees, led by Judas Maccabee, which is, Maccabee just means the hammer. Jude the hammer. He came to power in about 152 BC. Now, interestingly, in Jewish lists of high priests, there's a 7-year gap from the death of the high priest in 159 until 152, when Judas Maccabee came to power. Was appointed the high priest.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. I didn't know this either. Again, Dr. John Ben Daniel and his research papers, very, very informative. Based on 1 Maccabees 10, there does appear to have been a high priest in place at that time, but his name has been scrubbed or erased from history.
By whom?
By later Jews. We don't know for sure who.
Oh, that's interesting.
But it's about this point in history that Josephus was writing, when later, in the first century, so about 225 years after these events, he introduces the three main factions of Judaism: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Interestingly, unlike the Bible, the New Testament, where we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees mentioned pretty regularly, the Essenes aren't mentioned at all. But Josephus writes far more about the Essenes than either the Pharisees or the Sadducees.
Okay, question. Did he call them Essenes?
Yes.
That is a Greek term.
Yes, it is.
And he was writing for the Romans.
He was writing for the Romans. But Philo of Alexandria, who was another Hebrew, another Israelite, another Jew, who was maybe a generation before Josephus. He wrote between about 20 and 50 AD, so probably 50 to 75 years before Josephus. He mentions the Essenes. Now, neither one of them outlines the origins of the Essenes specifically. So some of this reconstruction of history by Dr. John Ben Daniel is a bit speculative, but it's based on the evidence. However, both Josephus and Philo refer to the Essenes in the present tense, meaning that they were still around as late as Josephus toward the end of the first century AD.
Oh, that's interesting.
Josephus, even though he was a Pharisee, was very, very complimentary toward the Essenes.
What does Essene mean?
Essene comes from a Greek word, essenoi, which means essentially the pious ones. It's essentially the equivalent of the Hebrew word Hasidim, as in the Hasidic Jews, the pious ones, the righteous ones.
Yes, exactly, that we all understand today.
But the what's interesting
No,
is,
I want to stop you there.
Okay, yeah.
The Hasidic Jews are not
No, they're not
the
the Essenes.
inheritors of the Essene.
No, it's just a term, a word that means the same thing.
Okay, just want to make sure you...
Yeah. It is likely, based on what we can now discern from the writings of the Essenes, that they were probably the first Christians. And when I say this now, I'm not talking about the Essenes from Qumran. Most of us are aware of the Essene community at Qumran, where they preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls. What I didn't know until, again, reading the work of Dr. John Ben Daniel, was that Qumran was destroyed just after the death of Herod the Great.
What?
Qumran was destroyed. Now, it was rebuilt, but slowly during the reign of Herod Archelaus, his son. But they never produced any new writings after that. They copied some of the older writings. There was another Essene community that developed in the north near the Sea of Galilee, and specifically near the town of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from.
Right.
That was settled at about the same time as Qumran, around 100 BC.
Right.
Now, this was during a time of political changes in Israel. By this point, thanks to the Maccabees, who established the Hasmonean dynasty of priest kings in Jerusalem, there was some stability there. Judea was an independent country until about the year 40 BC.
Okay, for those of you who are like I am, I'm very visual. When someone tells me something, I construct it in my head into a picture. I'm trying to picture where all of this is taking place.
Right.
Is this in what we call the Golan Heights?
No. Magdala is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, so it's in the Galilee. And a little village called Arbel, just west of there, is the vicinity where this northern Essene community split. And essentially what happened was the Essenes, who were known by this name at this point, and Philo of Alexandria is the one who mentions that there were Essenes, even in his day, living in Syria, where they were first called by that name. The Essenes appear to have split. There was a group of more moderate Essenes who lived in the north, and the group at Qumran, who were convinced that the ruling priests in Jerusalem were evil and that they would need to be just outside, a day's walk from Jerusalem to move in and take over and set up the temple of Ezekiel, described in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48.
Okay, so there are two branches.
Two branches of the Essene
individual
communities.
groups who are trying to be pure.
Right.
But they're doing it in different ways?
In different ways. The main difference is that the group in the north, they were willing to associate with other groups. In fact, there were a group of Pharisees that had moved north during a civil war in Judea. John Hyrcanus, who was a successor to Judas Maccabee, had to put down a rebellion that was fomented by the Pharisees, who wanted the Greek king Demetrius to come down and overthrow them and set up a new priest.
Oh, that's
so the
crazy.
Pharisees were kicked out of Jerusalem, and they went north into the Galilee.
Well, we think politics in Israel today is complicated.
It was just as complicated back then. But the bottom line is this. You had the group of Essenes at Qumran who believed that they needed to separate from everybody. We can't associate with any of these evil people. We need to cut ourselves off, and then God is going to return soon and set up his kingdom here in Jerusalem, and we'll be ready to move in and set up, and help God administer his new kingdom.
They were looking for actually a king who was going to be a political figure.
Right. A righteous one who would essentially again, fulfill the prophecy of Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48.
Right, but they didn't see a suffering servant.
They didn't see a suffering servant. They saw a geopolitical, right, exactly. Like most Jews in the first century, they were looking for a military leader.
Yeah.
The Essenes in the north were willing to associate with other groups, even though they still had certain rules that had to be followed. They had to wear linen, there was certain purity rules and things like that. But they were a little more open to associating with others. They were the authors, the ones who composed the Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71 of the Book of First Enoch.
Okay.
That's why it's not found at Qumran. The Qumran community would not have approved of some of the doctrines in the Book of Parables.
Now, isn't that interesting?
Right.
Because the Book of Parables is very similar to, as I've said earlier, these visions. They're very similar to the language used in the Book of Revelation by John.
Right. But there are some key differences from what the Qumranic community believed, and we'll have to leave it there and come back to this next week. The influence of the Book of First Enoch, specifically the second part of the Book of Parables, on end times prophecy. It's stronger than we thought, and it relates to where Jesus set up his ministry as well.
Amazing.
Yeah. Thank you for watching Unraveling Revelation.
Unraveling Revelation is a viewer-supported outreach of Gilbert House Ministries. Follow us online at unravelingrevelation.tv and gilberthouse.org. That's where you'll find our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship. Join us as we study the Bible every week, verse by verse, in chronological order. We'd love to hear from you. Contact us through our websites or drop us a line at P.O. Box 78, Crane, Missouri 65633.